Hello, it's Joseph, and welcome back to episode 19 of my Colonizing Kerbin series. Wow, it's crazy. We've gotten to 19 episodes of this series already. And this is a busy time for the Kerbal Space program in this playthrough. As you can see in the bottom right corner, it just disappeared. Got a lot of alarms coming up, a lot of maneuvers and things happening. So let's get into what's going on. And the first thing we're going to be doing in this episode is launching a relay satellite network to Duna. Now, we currently have a relay satellite network around Kerbin, around Mun, and around Minmus, and it has been in place since episode 8. This satellite network has been helpful as Kerbin rotates, as Minmus rotates, as craft go behind moons and things like that. The communication lines gets obstructed, and currently in the game I have Kerbal comm network turned on. So if a probe-controlled vessel were to lose connection to the Kerbal Space program, I have it set in the game settings to where you have partial control of the probe. And that could mean the difference between a successful mission and a non-successful mission. For example, right now, this booster landing has complete access to the Kerbal network, and if it didn't, while it was landing, the atmospheric, drag that is creating interference in the signal could mean losing connection, and the probe is unable to land safely. So having the networks in place is an important part of this playthrough. Now, I'm actually launching the same exact craft that I launched twice back in the previous episode towards Jool. So this craft should have plenty of delta V to get to Duna. The craft was designed to get 6 relay satellites to Jool using Tylo gravity assist. So right there, it's already got to have roughly around 2100 meters per second, maybe less if you get a more efficient burn towards Jool. And that's way more delta V than necessary to get to Duna. And you also saw some side tanks and engines being separated from the craft. So that gives some additional delta V that was originally meant for getting the craft to Jool. So anyway, we're now setting an alarm so that we know when the craft will need to do its capture burn maneuver. Since there's so much delta V in the craft, it can basically go straight to Duna without having to do any alignment burns along the way. And moving forward, year 5, day 326, our next alarm has gone off, and only a few days later, and basically our alarm is telling us that the Kerbals want to launch a drone to fly to Duna in order to basically scout the planet for potential landing sites for the base when we eventually colonize the planet. Now, this of course is a very good idea, and we are basically already doing that in real life. And this drone is a little bit inspired by the Ingenuity helicopter that is currently flying around on Mars and just had its 9th successful flight. But it is not, of course, a replica. It's just inspired. Replicating it is a bit more trickier to do in Kerbal Space Program. But the Kerbals feel it is important to scout out the area. Now, as a player, I like the idea of using a drone to scout out where I want to land, because even though the map screen, I can look at Duna and figure out, based on some limited low graphic topography as to where I want to land, it doesn't quite necessarily help me find the ideal spot to land on Duna. So that's basically what the role of this drone is going to be, is to scout out a landing zone for Duna. It also is equipped with some science modules so that it can also conduct some limited amounts of science and potentially maybe a new biome that we haven't been to. We've had one set of Kerbals go to Duna back in, I'm not sure when they launched, but I do remember that they returned in episode 10, and the science they gathered at Duna basically completed the tech tree for this playthrough of Kerbal Space Program. Now, this craft does have plenty of delta V to get straight to Duna and do the capture burn right at periapsis of Duna. So these 2 quick launches heading off to Duna should give you all the indication that right now we are pretty close to a Duna transfer window, and you are correct. The Duna transfer window is at year 5, day 331. And here is the final launch we're going to send off to Duna, a surface base. So the relay network, a drone, and a surface base are all heading off to Duna at this transfer window. So a very busy transfer window to Duna. Now, the Kerbals decided to make the choice to launch more craft at this time in a single transfer window. You may have noticed in last episode that we have been spreading out the launches to Jool. Well, that's because the amount of times a transfer window becomes available for Jool is actually more frequent than the amount of times a transfer window is available for Duna, despite the fact that they are closer in orbit. And part of the reason for that is because they are closer in orbit, they are moving at similar speeds around the sun, which means a transfer window is not open quite as often as it is for Jool. And the Kerbins are anxious to colonize Duna. They want to colonize it before they colonize Laythe. Laythe is much farther out. Even though there's more transfer windows available, there's more logistics involved in trying to colonize Laythe. And, you know, they're under a little bit of pressure. You know, they've had the success of colonizing the Mun and colonizing Minmus, and now they want to get out to another planet, something out, you know, beyond the sphere of influence of Kerbin, and colonize it. So the pressure is on, and they felt, you know, hey, we got the knowledge, we got the ability, let's launch these 3 launches now, get the base off there. So at the next transfer window at Duna, we are going to be launching our first set of colonists off to Duna. So keep watching the series to see when those colonists finally arrive at Duna and colonize the red friendly planet, just you know, hair's, you know, however far away it is. So the Duna base also has enough Delta V to go straight to Duna, and it too will be performing a capture burn. Yeah, the commentary was great there. I don't know where I was going with that. So if anyone's scratching their head, just you know, roll with it. All right, so our next alarm has gone off just a few days later, and we have a Jool transfer window open. So this transfer window, the Kerbins are just going to take the opportunity to launch one thing to Laythe, and that's going to be another drone. Now this drone is a different design. We will not see this drone arrive at Laythe in this episode, so keep watching the series to see this drone and see what it looks like. But this drone is going to basically serve the same purpose as the drone going off to Duna. But because Laythe has a higher atmospheric pressure, basically the atmospheric pressure is pretty similar to Kerbin, and the gravity is pretty similar to Kerbin, despite the fact that atmosphere doesn't go up as high. The Kármán line for Kerbin is 70 kilometers, and the Kármán line for Laythe is 50 kilometers. So, you know, that's interesting. Also, Laythe is too far away from the sun for a planet to have water on it, yet it is mostly covered in water. So having this drone go there to track down the few limited landing zones that are available on Laythe to find the idyllic spot to land a base is going to be very important in colonizing Laythe. So on the map screen here, these were just the side boosters that were deployed that helped get the Duna relay network off to Duna, and they are not needed, so they're just going to be deorbited. So our Laythe Aerodrone is now on its way out of the sphere of influence of Kerbin. It has just completed its burn. Well, it's about to complete its burn. Sorry, I got a little ahead of myself there. And now it's completed its burn. There we go. Getting the commentary in time. And the next maneuver has been made. So in a you know, about 2 years roughly, it should be ready to do that alignment maneuver. All right, so now we're off to the Laythe Relay, as you can see on screen, and we've missed the burn window. We are about 81 days late from the alignment burn. So I went on ahead and made that burn anyway, just to get the alignment of the orbit to be more in line with Tylo. And it looks like we're off by about 1.2 degrees, was about as good as I could get it. So it got me curious as to why we missed that. We shouldn't have missed that. There was alarms set for that, and I was really concerned as to why that was. Well, we're back in the tracking center. As you can see, there are flashing over there. You see the MET, which is the mission time of a craft for the relay networks, the science drone, the base, the Laythe Aerodrone, and then it flashes to MNV, which is whenever a maneuver is coming up. Well, for some reason, the alarm is not as trustworthy as I originally thought. And whenever you see me putting the mouse over a maneuver node, you'll notice that a little alarm clock image now will start to show up now that 1.12 has come out. And this is the second episode that I've been using 1.12. Well, you can click on that alarm and create a maneuver node. And I was setting a 1-day delay on the maneuver node, so that way the alarm would go off in order to make sure I wouldn't miss, the maneuver. And it looks like our Aerodrone for Duna has arrived, and it's about to perform its capture burn. So that's what's going on screen. So anyways, back to what I was saying. It seems that making the alarm that way is not the most reliable way to make the alarm. So what I have decided to do now is to reference the tracking center much more often, but also make the maneuver nodes be manual. So this alarm that just went off right now, I manually made that. Now I can still link it to the craft, so while I am in control of the Laythe Relay network, I can create a maneuver node and link it to the craft. But I think I'm going to try and do that more manually and not rely on the alarm that comes out from the maneuver node maker. Alright, so the alignment burn is complete, so now the Laythe Relay is on course to intersect Tylo and use the gravity assist to have a capture burn. And it looks like it's also on course for Laythe itself, and we've set up the next maneuver for it. And now the Jool relay is needing an alignment burn. Like I said, lots of alarms going off this episode, lots of things to keep track of since we have multiple craft on their way to our different celestial bodies. And the Jool relay network has done its burn. It is set to use Tylo and Laythe to capture at Jool. And its apoapsis is pretty close to its goal apoapsis. And basically that Jool network is going to go basically in orbit between Tylo and Bopper Pole. Alright, so now back to the Duna relay network. It is already at Duna, and it is performing its capture burn around Ike. So since this is the Jool relay network craft basically being sent off to Duna, there are 6 satellites. You really only need 3 satellites to set up a successful relay network. So I decided, and the Kerbals decided, I'm not really in charge, the Kerbals are in charge. Keep that in mind, audience. We decided that the first 3 satellites should be deployed around Ike, so that if we would like to potentially colonize it, we can. Now going back to the resonant orbit calculator, link in the description, we are going to set the apoapsis to 900,000 meters, which means in order to synchronize all of the satellites at equal distant orbits, we need to put the periapsis somewhere around 400,000 meters. 412,000 meters. So those 3 satellites have deployed from the mothership craft, and our first network satellite is circularizing its orbit. 900,000 meters is pretty close to where a craft can leave the sphere of influence of Ike, so I didn't want it to go any higher than that. We can't synchronize the orbits to where each satellite is facing a specific point, which would be a geosynchronous orbit, because Ike spins too fast for that basically. So we would basically, the craft would have to go outside the sphere of influence in order to do that, but then it's just in Duna's sphere of influence. So anyway, I decided to settle for basically as high as I could get away with comfortably, and also a round number basically to set the orbit. Now these relay satellites come with the new unfoldable solar panels. There's a magnetometer boom and some science. And they are also way over-engineered, of course. It's not necessary to have this many ion engines, but you know what? I like the look of it. The Kerbals like the look of it. And ion engines mean that they can last a long time in orbit and do a lot of correction burns, which is technically not needed in this game. Alright, so now the final 3 satellites have left Ike's sphere of influence and are now around Duna. Now, you can set satellites in a geosynchronous orbit around Duna. However, that orbit would intersect with Ike's orbit. So the Kerbals and I had originally considered making Ike the quote-unquote 4th relay satellite in the network and having the other 3 still be at geosynchronous orbit. But the thing is that Ike isn't perfectly at geosynchronous orbit, so there still is a risk that, now granted it would be a very long period of time, but over a period of time, a satellite could eventually intersect with the sphere of influence of Ike. So we decided to set the orbit at about 1,500,000 meters, which would be 1,500 kilometers above the orbit of Duna. So any higher than that, we would risk eventually getting into the sphere of influence of Ike. So it's about as high as we can go without risking getting into the sphere of influence of Ike. All right, so our 3rd satellite is now in place, ready to go, and it is circularizing its orbit. Earlier, I put up on screen how I'm using the resonant orbit calculator that I linked into the description to set up the satellites in orbit. So reference that to see where the periapsis is if you too would like to make a satellite network around Duna. And now we're just deorbiting the craft that got all those satellites there. Beautiful. Nice crash landing. All right, so before we are done with these networks, the Ike relay network is going to perform some science and transmit that science back to Duna. This is, of course, not necessary because we have already performed these science experiments in orbit of Ike. And we're also doing this in orbit of Duna. Once again, not necessary because our Duna mission several episodes ago completed those science experiments, but it's just to kind of show off the capabilities of the relay network. All right, so for the final time, we are back to the Laythe Relay, and we are performing the final alignment burn in order to get a Tylo capture around Jool. And it looks like that's going to put us at a pretty good location. Now, we are finally done with those networks for this episode. So let's move on to the final part of the episode. That's right, we are back at Duna for a final time, and the surface base has arrived at Duna and it is performing its circularization orbit. So now that that has arrived and the satellite network is in place, we can deorbit our Aerodrone down to Duna in order to start scouting around. So the Kerbins have decided to land the drone near this canyon-ish area. So the drone, as it's coming down, is going to deploy the parachutes, and then we're going to release the fairing that has protected it from atmospheric drag. We don't want those propellers to rip off, and deploy the heat shield, and the landing shield, the landing legs are deployed. All right, so I have one controller set up to run the RPM and torque of the fans, and then the other controller is set to the throttle. So the drone just separated from the parachutes and flew away safely, and the basically the Procore is basically the only thing that's coming down with those parachutes, and that Procore is going to be named the landing site area. And like I said earlier, this drone comes equipped with some science equipment. So we're running some gravity scans, some atmospheric pressure scans, just so we can make sure that this is really the area we want to establish a colony. So even though colonists can't breathe on Duna, we do want to know what the conditions are on this area. So the Kerbals are not satisfied with the base being in a valley. They kind of like to have things up on a hill so that they can have their bases be a bit scenic. After all, these Kerbals are going to be on Duna the rest of their natural lives, and it's important that they enjoy where they are. Duna is pretty barren. I mean, it's red, that's kind of cool, but it is barren. So finding that nice scenic locale is going to be important for long-term survival upon the planet. So it looks like the Kerbals are satisfied with this landing zone, even though we have a whole planet to explore, but it is the first colony. We could potentially bring out more colonies later. But it's time to bring the surface base down, and as you may or may not guess by looking at this thing, it flies through the thin atmosphere of Duna about as well as a brick would. But those side engines that I have mounted there, which is the aerospike engines, are perfectly centered around the center of mass. What makes the craft unstable is, of course, the atmospheric drag. But after about 6 or 7 attempts, we are deploying the parachutes and firing the engines. And by the way, the parachutes, as you can see, covered up the screen there for a second. And of course, I'm playing back the footage at 400 times speed, but at normal speed, by the way, we weren't 100% satisfied with that locale, so we're moving the base a bit. But at normal speed, I was not sure that the base had survived. The parachutes were covering up the screen, so I was sitting there just going, Is it alive? And thankfully, it was. All right, so now we can deploy those engines and fire them up, and they are going to go off and crash themselves and be destroyed. There's a a rover attached to this base, so that when the Kerbals eventually arrive, they can drive around. And this is an upgraded version of the rover that is on the Mun. And that's basically it. So the base is set up, everything deployed correctly, the solar panels are in place, so the base has power and is ready for our Kerbals to arrive. And the drone has taken its place next to the rover and the base, and it's too waiting for the potential occupants of this colony. Well, thank you so much, the few of you that watched this series, and I hope you're getting as excited as I am, because we are almost ready to colonize Duna. See you next time.